We're continuing our conversation about storytelling with data and creating dashboards. And in the next video, we'll show how to make a dashboard. But right now, let's look at a couple more visualizations that you might want to include in your dashboard depending on what information, what story your data is conveying. So we've looked at some different dashboards like this economic dashboard. We've looked at the wait list for healthcare centers in Calgary. We've looked at a web analytics dashboard. Now, if your dashboard is going to be looking at financial performance of the organization, then you may want to create what is called a Sankey diagram. We also want to look at if you are looking at operations monitoring, organizational goals, or even financial performance, you might want to create a gauge that shows how you are doing compared to a goal. So comparing a number that is your current where you are in your KPI to where you want to be. So let's look at how to create those in Python before we move to the full dashboard. So we are working in this dashboard workbook. You can find this dashboard workbook at drstephpowers.github.io/BIA right here where it says dashboard. And once you are in there, of course, open in Google Colab, save a copy so that you can edit it. So let's look at how to create a Sankey diagram. So a Sankey diagram looks like, and I keep zooming out when I come across this. So here we have, if I can get it to move around a bit here. Here we have a Sankey diagram. What it shows is that Apple has 394, I think it's $1 billion in revenue. And then from that, 224 goes to the cost of revenue. So that's the expenses related to, particularly to their products or their services. That means they have gross profit left over of 170. That gross profit, then 51 of it goes to research and development. The rest goes to earning before taxes. When you combine that with their non-operating income and expenses, that becomes their net profit before taxes. And then 19 goes to taxes, 103 is left over for net profit after taxes. And because there's long labels here and I can't seem to get it to zoom in like it's supposed to, then what we have here is that the text is overlapping here. But this is what a Sankey diagram looks like. And there's lots of different packages to do Sankey diagrams. I find a lot of them a pain in the ass and super fiddly. So we'll look at one that's easier than others, but recognize that if you're going to do a dashboard in Dash, it does require you to do Plotly graphs. So you might want to investigate the Sankey diagram using Plotly rather than what we're doing here, although I find that one a pain in the butt. So if it's not for a dashboard, if it's simply for an infographic, a visual, and a presentation, then consider using this particular one. We are going to use a table called Sankey that you can find the same place you got this Python workbook. And I'm just going to show you here what this data set looks like that we're actually going to port in. Or I don't know, why am I even bothering? I can just port it in and then do this. So here we have, let's port it in. We've already connected this particular data set to our Google Drive, and Sankey here, this file is in our Google Drive, and in this case in my Google Drive, in my BIBA handbook folder, inside a folder called Chapter 7. So if I load that in and I have it show me the table, what you see is 3 columns. We have the source, the target, and the value. And so the key here is that the revenue is divided into gross profit and cost of revenue. So 170 is the amount of revenue that goes into gross profit, and 224 is the revenue that goes into cost of revenue. So if you watch the network models, the graph models video, you will see that this is kind of the same setup when it comes to network models: source, target, and then a weight here. So what we're showing here is that total revenue is 170 plus 224, and then it gets divided up into gross profit and cost of revenue. Gross profit gets divided up into earnings before interest and taxes and research and development. So we can see this 170 gets divided up into 119 and 51. That earnings before interest and taxes gets divided into, or goes directly into net profit. It's combined with net operating income and expenses. So net profit is the combination of these EBIT and net operating expenses. And then net profit is divvied up between taxes and then the profit after taxes. So here we have source, target, and then how much money, because here we're looking at financial data, flows from the source to the target. So we can look at how the money is divvied up, the flow of money. So if we look at our graph visualization chart, Sankey diagrams appear in the flow section because we're showing the flow of money. All right, so let's take this and we are going to import Holoviews as HV and import pandas as PD. Now, if you are using Holoviews inside Google Colab, there are two things you need to know to make it run, because there are some packages that don't work well inside of Google Colab. They're built for if you're doing like your Python code in, say, Microsoft Visual Studio. So if you want to run this in Google Colab, first you have to run this environment here. So we need to initiate this. And then the other thing you need to do is all of their things related to your Sankey need to be in the same little entry cell here as hv.extension bokeh. And this is going to then create this visual inside our Google Colab here. So if you took this piece out, then it wouldn't run. We need to make sure that this hv.extension bokeh is in every cell related to this particular Sankey diagram. So what we're going to do is we are going to create our Sankey diagram using HV Holoviews. We're going to take our table DF5, that was the import that we did that looks like this. It needs to have source, target, and value in it. And then we're going to give that graph a label, and this is the financial data for Apple. And then we're going to change some of the optics here. So the Sankey.ops label position, we're going to put the name here on the left. Edge color is going to be based on target. Node color is going to be based on index. So we're changing the color for the different parts so that so we have different colors here. So if I look at this, is that initially, so that's easier to see. When you initially load it, it's nice and big, and we can see the Sankey diagram here. You can zoom in and out. It does have some function keys for interactivity on it, but it does create, a nice visual here for the Sankey diagram. Again, if you want to create a Sankey diagram in other programs, there is a Sankey package. There is a Plotly command that does Sankey. I find them much harder to work with than this particular one. So this one seems to make nicer visuals that are quite simple to make. Compared to some of the other ones. We also want to look at how to make Sankey diagrams using Plotly Express, because Plotly Express can be used for dashboard programs like Dash and for Streamlit. And so we do have videos where we look at creating dashboards with Dash and ones with Streamlit. So if you do decide you want to add a Sankey diagram to one of those, then you need to know how to do the Sankey diagram in Plotly. So we have our data here, just like we did before, with the source and the target and the values. If we're doing this in Plotly Express, we're going to have to import plotly.graphObjects as Go, and we're going to have to import matplotlib.pyplot as PLT. Now, when you set it up in Plotly to do a Sankey diagram, you will need to set it up a bit differently. And this is why I was saying that it's not as easy to use or to create Sankey diagrams in other programs as it was in the one we just showed you. So let's walk through it a little bit. And we're going to set up the same exact Sankey diagram as we just did. And so we have here, right, that we have 170 goes from revenue to gross profit, and the 220 goes from revenue to our costs. So we start here as we start with, let's start here at 0, and we go 0 to 1. That movement is going to be $170, and then from 0 to 2 is the 224. So to help you kind of lay this out, I would actually start with the labels. So we start with the labels and we actually name them. So we're going to say here that revenue is 0, gross profit is 1, cost of revenue is 2, earnings before interest and taxes is 3, research and development is 4, net profit is 5, and taxes is 6, and net profit after taxes is 7. We do that labeling with this note here. So see how it's green, see how it's after a hash symbol. So it's not actually part of the code, it's just a little note for us. And we do that because we need it to actually create the source target information at the beginning. So when we do this, then we know that when we say if we start at 0 and go to 1, we're going from revenue to gross profit, and that amount is 170. Then when we go from revenue to cost of revenue, that's 0 to 2, that's 224. So it's helpful to lay out these labels first so that you can essentially build a version of this where it's source and target, except for the Plotly one wants it to have numbers. Okay, so it's going to have numbers. So it's why writing this out and then giving each of these a number helps as you're trying to build this table. So that's why it's not as intuitive as the previous version. So 1 to 3, that's going to be gross profit to earnings before interest and taxes is going to be the 119. So essentially what I'm doing is building that same table as before, but with these numbers for each of these different items here. So then once we have our source, our target, and our values, then we are going to create a dictionary where the source is going to be that first list that you created. Your target is going to be that second list that you created, and the third list is going to be your values. So if you name this source, target, values, then your dictionary can be source equals source, target equals target, value equals value. And so you can just leave this code as is and just populate this top part. And the other thing you're populating right is the labels so that we actually can have the names attached to these different sources and targets. So it says target 0, target 1 here, but really this is just revenue is 0. And then when money is moving from revenue to something else, we see 0 in the source. Cost of revenue is target 2 or is number 2. And so when it is receiving the money, it's in the target. If it's where the money is coming from, it's in the source. So we can see money here, example, going from earnings before interest and taxes. A portion of that earnings before interest and taxes goes to net profits. Okay, so you can see how it's divvied up. Then we have here, in addition to our links, we have our nodes. So your nodes are going to be your labels. And then pad equals 50 and thickness equals 8 are formatting for how chunky your Sankey diagram is. And so you can play with changing those to get more spacing in between or to get them to be wider. So once we do that, then we're going to have our data is going to be go.sankey, and it's going to use the links and the nodes. So if you keep the code like this, then all you have to do is change the label and then change your list for the source, target, and value as you look at a different data set. So then we're going to do go.figure to actually create the Sankey diagram and have it show. Because we are in Google Colab, we are going to have it render equals Colab so that it will actually build the Sankey in our Google Colab so that we can see it. So we will generate that. And when we do that, we end up with a Sankey diagram that looks like this. So revenue, part of revenue goes to cost, the rest goes to gross profit. Part of gross profit is going to be our earnings before interest and taxes, and then we pay taxes, and then we get our profit after taxes. So you can see how you can make a Sankey diagram in Plotly, and the benefit of that is that it can then be used in a dashboard.